Mr. Pati, Singhania, and Dr. Gita Gopinath. Again, to begin the session, may I request Mr. Singhania to present the pledge certificate to Dr. Gita Gopinath. So, Dr. Gopinath, in your honor and your presence here, we would be providing a midday meal for a number of students for the entire year. So, thank you very much for your presence. May I now hand over the session to Mr. Singhania.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is a brief session, so we'll start right away. It's my pleasure and honor to have this panel, or rather this conversation with Dr. Gita Gopinath, who is the Economic Counselor and Director of the Research Department at the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. Very briefly, she did her BA from LSR here, and then studied overseas as well as in Delhi, and then finally got a PhD from Princeton. Her research is focused on international finance and microeconomics, and she has taught at the Chicago Booth School, Chicago's Booth School, as well as at Harvard University, and she's currently on leave, as I believe, from Harvard. We are very proud that you were born in India and of Indian origin, and being there, and so really welcome to this session. And so what I'd like to basically kick off with is this. We have, I don't want to get into statistics, but we've seen lots of numbers coming out recently from the RBI estimates of growth. IMF itself had its own growth estimate, which I read somewhere that you are probably going to review in January about India. Regrettably, a lot of these numbers have been on a downward slide. So the question really is, what can we do in India? Some specific 2-3 broad thoughts, and what can we do to bring back growth? Everybody talks about their issues being with demand, issues in terms of less investment. We've had a backdrop of moderate or low inflation. So within this, how would you see this, and how do we take this forward?
Thank you, Pati. It's a pleasure to be here. So what we've seen in the last few quarters is a steep slowing in private sector demand. So if you look at where growth has come in the last couple of quarters, it's relied quite heavily on the government sector. We've seen a sharp weakness in investment, but now also weakness in consumption growth. And you see a big cutback in imports, which also reflects low demand, and about, core inflation of about 3.5% is also consistent with low demand in the economy. Our expectation was that the first 2 quarters of fiscal 2019-20 would be a slowing scenario, and then there would be an uptick in the third and the fourth quarter. But looking at some of the high-frequency indicators, we're not seeing the kind of uptick we were projecting. So this is why I mentioned that we will be revising the numbers again in January when we put out the next update. So the question is, there are many aspects to it, but I just wanted to flag in one sense why there was this unpredictability about where the economy was going. One statistic that you have out there is a measure of business sentiment. And you see business sentiment, go back to 2014-15, it kind of holds up quite well into 2019. And in October, November is when you see this drop. in business sentiment. So those are movements that are hard to predict, and that was an important part. Now, more deeply speaking, what are the areas that are a source of the issue? One is with respect to the financing, the finance sector, with the banks and the non-bank financial corporations. The stress associated with them is more persistent and is deeper than many projected. So that will be the first place to address, which is an accelerated cleanup of banks. This will require more institutional infrastructure so that the insolvency and bankruptcy code that the resolution process can happen more rapidly. It's important for banks to be well capitalized. So again, what we've seen is that what looks like a decline in bank risk-taking appetite in India in recent months, and that's an important factor. And now, to be clear, I mean, pretty much everywhere in the world, when there has been financial distress or non-performing assets, it's taken a while for it to resolve itself. So it usually takes about 5 to 6 years for this to resolve itself. Now, on top of that, India has also needed to build institutions to address this. So there's a relatively new insolvency and bankruptcy code, a new company law tribunal. All of those features then compounds and delays, or rather extends a bit how long this takes. So that's one aspect that has to be addressed. The second, of course, is rural income. And rural income growth is very important. Now, the government has taken steps in terms of providing more income to farmers, but that's not going to permanently solve the problem. There is a big need for raising productivity in agriculture in India, and that's an important factor. And third, I would keep in mind the fact that for India, macroeconomic stabilization, macro stability is very important, which means stability on the fiscal front, a clear sense of keeping to the target of fiscal consolidation is very important. Now, that would require both increasing revenue mobilization and also rationalizing expenditures. So these are some of the issues that would need to be addressed, and hopefully that would then address sentiment and improve the outlook going forward.
Thank you. I want to pick on the last point that you mentioned in terms of fiscal consolidation. There has been a view that there needs to be more spending. And therefore, there should be a slight loosening of the targets. And the Reserve Bank, and recently, if you see even the Finance Commission, has said that there may be a flexibility of 0.5% stretching of the target in terms of the consolidation. Now, this is daunting, and I know that you have been advocating that we should not give up fiscal consolidation. But there perhaps could be headroom from things like disinvestment, from things like targeting subsidies, to be able to make up some part of the fiscal deficit. What are your views on this in particular? Because this is a big dilemma.
So firstly, it's important to keep in mind that when we talk about fiscal consolidation, of course, we also think of it as a medium-term target, right? So something that has to be addressed over a period of time and not necessarily overnight. But secondly, again, when you talk about the need for more spending on certain issues, that itself doesn't necessarily make it a problem. The question is whether that comes along with more revenue mobilization in other places. So if disinvestment were to happen, that would be one way of doing it. So the details of how the particular spending is taking place and how that's being supported for the revenue happening now or in the near future, I mean, that's very important. I mean, India's consolidated deficit, if you combine the center and the state, is the highest one of the highest in the G20. So it's high. Borrowing costs are high. Interest bills of the government are high. There is certainly the sense of a bit of crowding out of for the private sector. So it's not a free lunch, and this has to be, very, very carefully managed.
The other question which people have been asking in India is that, is this slowdown currently, is this structural or is this cyclical? Now, perhaps it may be a combination of both, but we'd be curious to hear your views as how do you view it from the IMF?
So, I mean, actually, this is something I studied back in around 2005 too. When looking at business cycles in emerging markets, they always tend to be the structural and the cyclical tend to move very closely together. Because why? Because by definition, being an emerging market means that you're undertaking structural changes and structural reforms all the time. So this dovetails in with the cycle. The question is, what we're seeing right now is weakness in investment. And if there is prolonged weakness in investment, that by construction affects potential growth because there's lower capital in the economy. And so then that becomes part structural going forward. And of course, there's no reason for it to stay there for the foreseeable future. You would expect that there would be a recovery and coming back to trend growth. But again, a cycle where you end up with very weak investment for a very long period of time ends up being structural, which is why I mentioned the need for fixing the problems on the financing side and for increasing sentiment towards, positive sentiment towards investment.
On the financing side, even the minister talked in the previous session about banks talking about the fact that there is enough money with them, but there aren't enough takers. There are two aspects. If money will be taken, if the borrowers believe they can make profits out of the investments that they make. That is where perhaps some of the issues lie. And I don't know if you view it this way, so that is my one question. The second is, there seems to be a fair amount of risk aversion. You talked about that as well in your opening remarks. So even when there are corporates who are willing to take loans, the kind of conditions that they come with become a big deterrent. I don't know how you would view that in terms of that.
Right, so the question is the weak credit growth a reflection of credit supply problems or of credit demand problems, right? I mean, that's a good question to ask. And I would say again here, both pieces are in play. On the credit supply front, for instance, if you look at the transmission of the monetary policy 135 basis point cut into lending rates, that's been, somewhat weaker than it was in the past. That has come down. So that is a suggestion that there is a credit supply problem. I think part of the issue of why banks' risk aversion or less risk-taking appetite, there is less risk-taking appetite is because, the banks have to worry about whether they have adequate capital. To figure out that, they need to know what the value of their assets are. If they have non-performing assets, they have to figure out what the value of that will be when there is a resolution. At this point, there is more information being obtained on that, the details of how the resolution process works, who the bidders will be, those things are being worked out. So that's one important factor that needs to be addressed. Then again, another source of the credit supply problem is with NBFCs. That was a major event in 2018. Many of us expected that kind of rectified itself, but what we're looking at when you look at the data more closely is that there still seems to be stress there. Even if some of the higher quality NBFCs are doing fine, there is still a segment of NBFCs that used to lend to MSMEs and households that are still not in the best of shape. And so that's another source of credit supply problem. On the credit demand side, of course, again, the question is the demand that's coming from rural sector. That's an important sector for India. And that's another factor that does matter.
Okay, if I may turn to the issue of regulation. You talked about some of those. One feeling that several people have in India is that there is a certain degree of regulatory overzealousness. So part of the issues that banks or financial institutions face in terms of credit terms, et cetera, come from those regulations. Now, they may be well-founded. The question is, are they, at this point in time, the best thing to do? And if I may just dovetail this with the fact that we have many overlapping regulations as well. So, I don't know, again, do you see the whole issue of multiplicity of regulations, reforms, you said rightly so, they are structural in nature, but too many reforms happening too fast for the economy to sort of digest and absorb them, is that perhaps an issue?
I mean, the economy needs reforms, and reforms are
well intended, no doubt.
Absolutely important, but there also needs to be an environment of regulatory certainty, which is, the clear rules of the game, and what the particular policies are and how it impacts you. There has to be clarity on that. And that is an important piece. I believe in the slowdown, regulatory uncertainty has played a role. And so that's another factor that needs to be addressed. I think that's, it's important for India to undertake reforms, but to be able to do this with clarity and greater certainty would help. I mean, this also applies to a good reform like the GST, which is important, has been very important for formalizing, helping formalize the Indian economy. But again, there certainly needs more to be done on, what the rules are to be able to improve compliance, what the rates are going to be. I mean, all of that makes a big difference.
Thank you. The current government and also the previous one has emphasized a lot on manufacturing. So the Make in India program, the aspiration that manufacturing should be almost 25% of GDP, when today it is really somewhere about 16 and 17. So, and also the backdrop where about 60% of our economy is services. Dr. Gopinath, how real do you think manufacturing, of course it can become bigger, but how real do you think manufacturing aspiration of being 25% of GDP, can this happen? Can India really also support manufacturing by being more export-led, like some of the Asian countries have done in the past? I don't know what your views might be on this.
To get manufacturing off the ground and for India to have a bigger presence on the export stage, that would require another set of very big reforms, right? There are important reforms that are needed with respect to land acquisition, with respect to labor laws, and it's hard to generate the ecosystem where you can end up with large-scale manufacturing, which can be just in time, so that they can be a big part of global supply chains without these kinds of reforms taking place. Now, we'd like to think that, with the government having a strong political mandate, this would be the right time to undertake those kinds of reforms. But in the absence of it, and if there is, again, there is an appetite to build infrastructure, but that takes time too. In the absence of it, India is missing out on what we are seeing globally in terms of shifts in global supply chains around the world, with all the developments that we've seen over the last year. So, but that's not something to give up on. I think that these are more generally very useful reforms to undertake, even if it's not going to have an immediate impact on manufacturing. But these need to be undertaken. They're good for the economy more broadly.
Now, shifting a little bit from India to the globe, and I'm sure people here would be disappointed if they didn't hear the chief economist, so as to say, of IMF not talk about that. What are some of the major global trends, as in the trade wars, partly that seems to be resolved? I don't know if it's resolved, but there seems to be some discussion between China and the US in particular. But this entire trade issue, and increasingly countries reverting to some degree of protectionism, How do you think this is likely to play out, and how does this impact India? Do you believe there are opportunities for us from India, or do you believe it poses barriers in terms of global supply chains that you just talked about?
So in terms of the global outlook, 2019 was a year when, it started out well right at the start of the year, and then there was a bunch of disappointing news going forward. And the two sectors where it was globally weak were manufacturing and global trade. In both those sectors, you saw the continuous string of bad news with weakening purchasing manager indices and weak trade growth. What we're seeing in the last couple of months towards the end of this year is what looks like tentative signs of stabilization. So, while through 2019, the services sector was holding up across the globe for many countries, there was a concern of whether the weakness in manufacturing would then translate into weakness in services. Now, you saw some of that for a country like Germany, which is a major manufacturing exporter. You definitely saw that. But more generally, services has held up. So, to say something on a positive note, which is that we're seeing signs of stabilization. Some of the big concerns that were there in 2019, like whether the tariffs would come about on December 15th, that has not happened. A phase one deal has been announced. Now we have to still look at the details of what the phase one deal looks like and how durable it's going to be. But there seems like there's some reduction in uncertainty on that particular front. There's some reduction in uncertainty on the Brexit front. So and there is a fair amount of financial easing that's happened globally in terms of monetary policy rate cuts across the globe. So if the financial conditions remain easy from a global sense, and if this uncertainty that was building up in 2019 now reverses itself, we are seeing, for instance, the auto sector that went into a deep dive in 2019, not just in India, but everywhere in the world, we're seeing that also bottoming out and recovering. So 2020 could possibly see a recovery and could be better than 2019. But that said, there are still many downside risks. So the uncertainty could move from trade tensions with one country to another country. They could reemerge. There could be more on the technology side. So many factors still remain. But, again, to leave on a little positive note is we've seen some tentative signs of stabilization with some possible improvement in 2020.
Dr. Gita Gopinath, on that positive note, I'm afraid we run out of time. Thank you very much for your perspective and remarks at this FICCI AGM session. Ladies and gentlemen, may I request you to thank her with a round. Thank you very much, Dr. Gopinath. Pleasure.
May I request Mr. Singhania to please hand over a memento to Dr. Gita Gopinath. Thank you very much for that. The Honorable Minister Shri Nitin Gadkari is already here. We will begin the session as soon as the stage is set.